Well, this is embarrassing to start a recording with this kind of admission. I have uh, recently sort of gone back to the drawing board in terms of metagram emotional tones. Um, in terms of so I don't quite understand my very earliest construction of emotional tones. Um, so I'm having to sort of reverse engineer that. And also, uh, uh, but also at the same time, I have, sort of allowed myself it's a possibility that I kept the metagram construction. Uh, I mean, there is something about it that I have to unlock that I don't understand. But it might also be that it does also need to be revamped or updated according to now my more advanced model of metatype. But it's very important that I recapture the original understanding of it, because otherwise my two-tier sort of tandem sort of dialectical sort of checking process of having two arms uh, uh, that accurately check each other, or that sort of draw from each other and check up against each other will sort of be broken. But anyway, um, so that is quite important. But so let me just state some of the things that are interesting. So I have for the first time found, um, and this I don't think that this is actually a new discovery, because it seems to be familiar to me. Um, and I have kind of looked at this same property from other sort of frames, from other perspectives. But essentially, one of the biggest elements within emotional tone, uh, sort of my theory of cognitive inflections, is, and this is also the fundamental thing that I don't yet understand properly. Um, I think it is the problem that I'm having is that I've actually forgotten my earliest definition of emotional tones, um, where I describe a master regulator and a utilized faculty, and then there are like two other faculties, uh, which are sort of possible sort of things that get perhaps, this is a little bit speculative because I haven't worked it out, are sort of the other two faculties are perhaps either, sort of either ones can be used, or they can be used in conjunction with one leading the other one, or something like that. Um, and that could also mean that within the master regulator and the utilized faculty, and then the two that are sort of potentially there to be used, um, not when I say used, I don't mean the same as utilized. I mean sort of are can sort of express themselves in the backdrop of having a master and a utilized, sort of thing, that these are then the content which is being expressed within that sort of precondition of master and sort of medium, the utilized faculty, even as I'm saying this, some of it starts sounding familiar, but I don't actually know what the two leftover faculties, I don't really know how they function, but if they are the two that are left over, if the expression of the one, um, or the content of the one, then would amount to the definition of an emotional tone, and the use of the other one would relate to an emotional tone. And in this way as well, perhaps there are. I think it's a little bit spooky in some sense, because whatever the actual constellation of these things in terms of how they work together, is that there needs to be multiple definitions. According to this most primordial, this was literally the most primordial model that I had of cognitive inflection, that that I believe that there were essentially, there was an ambiguity then, because an emotional tone, a particular emotional tone, could have the same name, but it could have essentially a different master regulator and a different, but essentially that there was a similarity in, or a kind of, essentially, that there would be essentially a way of constructing an equivocation, even though you've got a different master regulator and utilized faculty, but essentially that this is describing sort of a basic equivalency. Is the actual expression of the faculties, um, that are the content in this backdrop of having a master regulator and a utilized faculty, then they also can be master regulators and utilized faculties, and then and in some sense this is also reminiscent of the idea that that there are separate circuits, um, because the emotional tones that that are being expressed within the backdrop of that sort of that medium and master regulator, um, can't be coexistent with other emotional tones that use that master regulator or utilized faculty. Um, anyway, so yeah, I mean, this is so abstract that it's probably going to be almost impossible to follow. But this to me was the codex that I used in order to sort of map the cognitive functions, the cognitive inflections and the emotional tones. That's what I call cognitive inflections, emotional tones, which then, but they all came from actually a very sort of abstract, ephemeral, almost sort of observation of these component parts that were conceptualized in this very complicated way of and then it became a lot more easier after I worked out the actual, let's say, the different packages of spin and commodities, so sort of like I forgot all of this stuff, because this was such a broad abstraction. It's almost like the difference between sort of theoretical, sort of sub-quantum physics or something like that, looking at, sort of just mathematical, sort of matrices and things like that, and then actually saying, well, no, these are the sets of elementary particles, and these are the spins that they have. So you don't need to look at the more, sort of sophisticated sort of ephemeral observation, or so anyway, that codex is still something that I'm going to have to meditate over. Anyway, okay, anyway, Now, the interesting thing is obviously how this intersects with the 17 model, because this is what I always used to, in my older recordings, this is the difference between the 12 model this is how I used to refer to it. The 12 model also refers to metagram, refers to emotional tones, cognitive inflection, all this stuff. Because the reason why I call it the 12 model is because all the cognitive inflections are made up of only of 12 um, uh, uh, ingredients. So like the codex that I was even talking about, has all these master regulators and utilized faculties and then other things, and they are all in sets of 4, and so the 12 is divided by 4, but then this codex has sort of arrows linking. Actually, no, they just link to more sets of 4, actually, so there is no cross-pollination there. Um, but, there's a missing step somewhere between my modern emotional tones and that codex, and that uh, there was obviously a link between some master regulators and utilized faculties are the same as other master regulators and utilized faculties in other sets of 4, and so the expressed content of which could actually sort of commingle or have a propitiative effect on them, and you could actually get, and the combinations of those things are what reduce the ambiguity of the emotional tones. Because as I was saying, that in the codex form, um, there are 2 ways to produce an emotional tone, and in some sense, the only way to stabilize that was with some form of adaptation of cross pollination, in seeing which master regulators and utilized faculties had the same sort of uh, uh, intermingling or something like that. Anyway, so I'm trying to reverse engineer this, and one of the things that I've come across is that, and by the way, those 3 sets of 4 within the 12 are, I link this to the Hindu classification of guna, which means nature, of sattva, rajas, and tamas. So these are the alchemical, each of those 4 are the alchemical elements that are in some are in some ways quite heavily related to sattva, rajas, and tamas. Okay. I have to say that slightly tentatively, because my emotional tones that I'm sitting with after some extra step that I'm still trying to reverse engineer is that there are 8 emotional tones, and I associate each of those tones with each guna. But the emotional tones, the ingredients of the emotional tones that I associate with each guna do always have the 4 elements of that guna, but they also include 4 elements from the other, from one of the other ones. So, in this sense, Rajas is a combination of Sattva and Rajas. Sattva is a combination of Tamas and Sattva, and Tamas is a combination of, let me just look, Rajas and Tamas, which is obviously, that's a bit of a ludicrous way of talking about it. This just because I don't have another piece of jargon to, but essentially when I say when I've just made those combinations, I'm referring to those 4 sets, those 3 sets of 4 elements. Now the interesting thing is I've now found a more stable way within the 17 model of defining sattva, rajas, and tamas, in terms of those initial 4 elements that correspond to each, which is quite interesting. So that's why I made this recording, is I want to talk about that, which is a bit of a rediscovery. Anyway, so the interesting thing is that within the 17 model, you have the 12, and you have the final 5, or the extra 5, which are not at the end of the 12, they are dispersed throughout. And so the final 5, or the 5 that don't correspond, or that aren't involved in the 12, correspond to the 3rd dimension, the 7th dimension, the 11th dimension, the 14th dimension, and the 16th dimension. Those are the final 5. The reason why I wanted to talk about this is because it has a bearing on some ideas around looking at the 17 model and using it as a guide in a sort of understanding of philosophy of mind and such. It actually brings it together quite nicely, holistically, and also understanding certain religious things like the Trinity and things like that as well. So I've never quite been sure about what to call the 3rd dimension. I've sometimes described it as the fire in the eyes of the Lord, or perhaps related to the Lord God of Hosts, or the Lord of Hosts. I've always thought of it as sort of the burning bush. For some reason, that's always sort of popped up for me. Anyway, I shouldn't talk so mystically, but anyway, I'm going to. So the 3rd dimension, the 7th dimension, the 11th dimension, the 14th dimension, and the 16th dimension. Now, this, okay, I don't want to repeat everything, but essentially the 16th dimension is the Father, the 14th is the Word or the Son, and the 11th is the Holy Ghost, and the 7th dimension is the blood, and the 3rd dimension, I'm not sure what to call it. And then things that should be mentioned, which are important, is the 4th dimension, which is the water, and the 2nd dimension, which is the spirit. And it's interesting that the 2nd dimension, the 4th dimension, and the 7th dimension, if you take 17 dimensions and you fold it in half, 9 is exactly in the middle, which is also, I call the door to heaven, or, sort of, anyway, the 9th dimension, discerning. Then 2 corresponds with 16, 7 corresponds with 11, and 4 corresponds with 14. So those are interesting things, that there's a kind of symmetrical overlap there. Anyway, that's almost like trying to sort of beg the question of sacred geometry and other stuff like that. But now what I'm going to talk about is, now those were sort of intuitions that I've always had, that those were important dimensions, and and obviously that corresponds with what's written in 1 John chapter 5, and there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one, and there are 3 that bear witness in the earth, the blood, the water, and the spirit, and these 3 agree in one. Anyway, so and what has actually spurred me to discover more, when I've remade this discovery, is in the book of Revelations. It talks about the 7 spirits of God, and I thought, I always think of it as how it's written in 1 John chapter 5, but if you have to put it in 7, then what do you have to say about the 7? And that also led me to talking about the rushed and the shy stuff as being, because rushed and shy include the water and include the spirit. Um, sorry, I think there's also another one as well that I mentioned, but I think it's mainly sort of, those are the ones that negate the spirit and negate the water is rushed and shy. So I gave some sort of philosophy about that, maybe some sort of social commentary in politics and in a kind of spiritual sort of discourse. Anyway, as being sort of the residue, a cultural residue of perhaps decadence and corruption, and an affront to the proper functioning of the spirit, but perhaps also the storehouse of mysteries that need to be um, digested and solved, and also that there perhaps is some use for, you know, sort of being rushed and shy in some sectors of pedagogy, that you can't deal with everything. In some sense, that is what, in some sense, it's sort of the realization that we have to be confronted with the problem of time, in some sense, that time itself is something that has to be contended with, and that's also why perhaps we have these these fleshly um, earthen vessels that are bound to a kind of a karmic obstacle that has to be overcome. Uh, and that means working out how to responsibly manage, you know, sort of these two emotional tones. Anyway, because I do think that these emotional tones are effectively what karma is made out of. But anyway, karma simply means consequence, because any emotional tone will have an endless sequence, will be part of an infinite regress, and also hypothetically a continuing sequence that has no end. I think the only way to actually transcend it is to actually have um, a kind of self-consistent loop that, anyway, I don't want to talk too much about that. It's going to be a tangent, but that you've basically found agreement throughout the whole circuit, that you have a model of an agreement throughout the whole circuit, so that you are sort of, you have a complete internal locus of control, or at least mastery over the thing that you conceive of, and then you're much more capable of judging it and updating it, and, you know, sort of quickening it, or, you know, sort of sacrificing it, or improving it, or whatever. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. That's a bit of a tangent. Okay, so anyway, the second dimension and the fourth dimension, I think, are important. Okay, I'll have to talk about. Okay, so how the gunas are situated within the 17 model. That's what I'm going to talk about. Um, so it's interesting that if you basically go through each dimension, and you put in, obviously, so you take all the dimensions in order that they appear, and you use the final 5 as breakpoints, then in between final 5 dimensions are always dimensions that relate to the same guna. You know, so it's very interesting that sort of between dimension 3 and dimension 7, there is dimension, obviously, 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 6 are all Rajasic elements. Between the dimensions of 7 and 11 is 8, 9, 10. All of those are tamasic. Between the dimensions of 11 and 14 is 12 and 13. Both 12 and 13 are sattvic. And between 14 and 16, there's just 15. 15 is rajasic. And now here's almost the exception, but it's almost the exception that proves the rule, is that between dimensions 16 and dimensions 3, because you see, when you go past 17, you loop back around again. So, or that should perhaps be revised here slightly. So, like, because there's no natural breakpoint between 7, or actually, I'm about to explain that there is a natural breakpoint between 17 and 1. but essentially that it's like a pyramid, and it's like a fractal, that when you reach the pinnacle of the pyramid, you get to the base of the pyramid. So you go from the pinnacle of the pyramid, the pyramid just recreates itself afterwards. So it goes from 17 to 1, and 1 up all the way to 17 again, and then from 17 back to 1. And in some sense, the thing that is really regulating that is the 16th dimension, the Father. So between 16 and 3, there is 17, 1, 2. There are 3 dimensions between 17 and 3. Sorry, between 16 and 3, which is 17, 1, and 2. And 17 is tamasic, but 1 and 2 is sattvaic. And so that is the only, between those two breakpoints is the only set of dimensions between two breakpoints which comport to two separate gunas. Which is also why I think that 1, 2, and 3 are the most 17, 1, 2, and 3 are the reason. This being a mixed bag, as it were, means that you have to. I think that within the 17 model, what might be one of the apexes of self-actualization and proper understanding is sorting out these sets of guna and separating them, and because then they can properly function. And I do think that the proper functioning of them does correspond with John's description of the blood, the water, and the spirit. Because then you see the spirit is dimension 2, and that is also a sattvaic element, and then it kind of it corresponds. Okay, sorry, I didn't talk about the significance of the breakpoints. So the breakpoints can. The reason why you use them as breakpoints is because this whole thing is like a pyramid structure. And the pyramid structure also implies sort of that the lower step of the pyramid supports the higher steps. So, and the higher steps are inculcated within the lower steps. And so everything is, it's like Russian dolls. Like this Russian doll, the bigger one contains all the smaller ones. But in some sense, I think that the breakpoints really are separate. The reason why the final 5, I call them the final 5, the reason why that they're so important is because they are real fundamental constituents of your consciousness and your self-awareness. The difference between the 12 and the 5 is that the 12 are like the content of one's conscious grammar, whereas the final 5 are the purveyors, or they are the actual awareness of the objects. And anyway, so they are like the see, each of them have their own sort of different characteristic, but anyway, so they are very fundamental nodes, and the higher dimensions that are stacked on top of them, the ones that are immediately stacked on top of the closest final 5, it's kind of like their realm. It's kind of like it's sort of, they are the supporting structure that gives, and it might also be that the final 5 they can be modeled metaphysically, but they might also have a kind of fundamental, almost material substrate as well. In terms of, so anyway, I don't want to, but essentially they are, I mean, another way of perhaps calling them or naming them is something that they are sort of the intrinsic fact of having a soul, something like that. But it is actually the thing that allows consciousness to be agentic, or anyway, I've got much better descriptions of this in other parts of it. But anyway, let me just get down to the nuts and bolts of it. So it's interesting that essentially in the seven spirits of God, or the three that bear record in heaven and the three that bear witness in the earth, um, that the three that bear witness in the earth are the spirit, the water, and the blood. Those are ways of naming the three gunas, because the spirit represents sattva, the water represents rajas, and the blood represents tamas. Because dimensions 8, 9, and 10, it's also it's very hard to if you look at each dimension individually and you look at dimensions 8, 9, and 10, if you don't ground them in dimension 7, the blood, you will be lost in a kind of tamasic indolence and abstraction, and just look at hypothetical hope and hypothetical, oh, well, wouldn't it be nice if we could, sort of have a different trust in something? Dimension 10 is trust, dimension 9 is hope, dimension 8 is, that doesn't have such a nice name, because it's much more concrete. I call it appraisal. It's how things ought be, your sense of I mean, I also call it the earth. Dimension 8 is because all the dimensions that lead up to it, from dimension 1 to dimension 8, sort of inform the earth. It's a very extroverted sensing, the immediate potential of a situation, but that's grounded, within the other things that are in the earth. So I mean, it is also supported by the understanding of the spirit and the water. Anyway, so, but you can get lost in that. You can get lost in that if you don't ground it in the blood, because what is your subjective potential? What is the energy that you have? What is the ability and capacity that you have? What is your power and self-interest in anyway, I don't want to go into the components of the dimensions. There's also something that is going to be too tangential, but anyway. But I do think that tamasic, uh, those tamasic dimensions are very misleading, especially if you don't ground them in the blood. And the blood has quite a sort of a conservative nature in it, in its very essence. That sort of it's the blood. I mean, I can describe it a little bit with some metaphor, is that the everything that happens to you, everything that you do and that you eat, and that how you sleep or whatever, it all lands up as a the bandwidth of your consciousness uh, has a memory attached to it, which is your blood. If you were very upset yesterday, if you were sick yesterday, if you have bad emotions, whatever, these things all have a material substrate in the blood. The blood is really a fixture and of your consciousness. Your consciousness is directly perceiving your blood in some sense. And if you don't ground dimensions 8, 9, and 10 in the blood, I think that you will be sort of prone to a kind of impudence and, sort of, what's the word? Sort of orchestrating the affairs of others and things like that, and sort of I can't remember the word, but it connotates like manipulation and things like that, and sort of it's interesting that for example, in Hinduism, there is quite a good spiritual regulatory principle that one should not take on other people's spiritual responsibility. Because you do them a tremendous disservice in terms of being able to develop and sort of be educated or something like that, or you're spiritually disempowering them by diluting their of them being able to be aware of their own spiritual burden, as it were, so as to not diffuse that work. I mean, that doesn't mean that you can't help them, but to not essentially dispense their spiritual duty. It's also essentially not possible, which is why it's problematic. Because if you think that you're doing it, you're creating very convoluted karma, or very sort of, I would even argue, sort of tamasic karma, specifically because it's actually dealing with these sorts of dimensions. You're creating paradoxes because you're actually acting beyond your own blood in some sense, and you're actually sort of abrogating other people's blood. In some sense, I think the Christians do have the correct sort of workaround to this, is that, well, if you drink other people's blood, but at the same time you're also breaking each other's bread, you're breaking down the understanding, and you're re-consuming it, you're re-imbibing it, you're re-digesting it. So there isn't just sort of the sharing of blood in the communion. It's that is a means to the breaking of the bread. And without the breaking of the bread and just the sharing of the blood, you have, I think, something of a monstrosity or some kind of abomination, because then you're really just part of some kind of worldly dominion, or some kind of narrative scheme or something like that. Anyway. Okay, it's interesting that some of this grappling, which is a perennial thing that needs to be sort of, I think this is quite a, I think that what I'm saying is not something that people should learn about spirituality out the gate. It's not one of the first things that you should be confronted with. What I'm talking about around the blood, I think, is sort of, this is quite a sophisticated topic, but it's interesting that this problem is almost observed by very toxic forms of maladministration as well, because I do think that there there are almost intuitive hierarchies that set themselves up within the narrative. Uh, that often narratives rely on a kind of imposed hierarchical system, which is just sort of taken for granted. Sort of the either the divine right of kings, or it's sort of sort of like a kind of a natural hierarchy or something like that. And there is something akin to that, perhaps, in terms of that there is a time and a place for things, and you have to sort of be able to, in some sense, act within your own subjective container that is appropriate to your blood. And some people seem to have blood that is so much more efficacious, and you almost can't hypothetically try to engage in that sort of too much, because it becomes overt, sort of strange kinds of projection and envy, and oh well, I could just have this other identity and then everything would be easy. And you don't know the first thing about being somebody else, really, and you in some sense don't know the you haven't surveyed their spiritual um, and what's the word that means sort of accounting tabulation. You haven't seen their balance sheets. You haven't seen their spiritual balance sheets in terms of their spiritual duty. So that's not to say that So sort of, again, like all these sort of things of second guessing the blood sort of takes you into an abstraction, takes you into sort of God's eye point of view of things when you start trying to use the 8th, 9th, and 10th dimension in a way that isn't actually orientated from within your blood. And you realize, just what an indolent person you become when you start trying to hypothetically mediate your own identity. Uh, you know, within some, sort of metric of reductionism, or some kind of, which is probably made out of dimension 10 or dimension 9, um, sort of trying to sort of impose and project something on dimension 8. But anyway, so dimension 7 is also one of the final 5. And it is the thing that supports dimension 8, 9, and 10. And so I think it's very important to relate dimension 8, 9, and 10 into dimension 7, and to ground it in dimension 7, as 6, 5, and 4 need to be grounded in dimension 3. And dimension 2, 1, and 17 are grounded in dimension 16, the Father. And then you have that interesting sort of internal fracture between dimension 17 and dimension 1, because dimension 17 is tamasic, dimension 1 and 2 is sattvaic. And so I do actually think that if you conflate or combine dimension 1 and dimension 17, then I think you kind of spoil dimension 1, that you have to keep dimension 17 and dimension 1 separate. You can't flow from dimension 17 into dimension 1 as a you can't let dimension 1 be supported by dimension 17. You have to, oh no, what's this? I'm kind of trying to say that dimension 17 needs to be seen as the result flowing from dimension 1 upwards, that you have to go from dimension 1 to dimension 17. You can't go from 17 to 1 to 17. What am I saying here? That you have to regard it as a new cycle. You have to regard it as that when you take dimension one, you have to kind of partition it from dimension 17. That dimension 17 really has to sort of be the end of a cycle, and then dimension 1 is the beginning of a new one. Anyway, and that is somewhat symbolized by essentially not, let's say, creating an alloy or an amalgamate between tamas and sattva. That if you combine dimension 17 with dimension 1, you are combining tamas into sattva. And now it's interesting because I've said that the sattvaic emotional tones are naturally actually comprised of sattva and tamas elements. Anyway, but I still think it's possible to use emotional tones, even though I've even said that they are fundamentally karmic. I think that you can still use them transcendentally. It's how you use them in some sense, and how you use them, you can't reduce them into terms of themselves, because they are infinitely sort of, you can create an infinite regress. It doesn't, it's the style of the 17 model, how that is comporting itself, that is showing itself through the emotional tones in some sense. Anyway, I'm not going to describe that more delicately. It's going to be too much of a tangent, but so what is my point here? Is that so what's interesting as well is that the real ambiguity then comes from dimension 16, because dimension 16 supports both tamas and sattva. And so it's dimension 16 itself, that the conception of dimension 16, that must remain, the partition between dimension 1 and dimension 2 that I was talking about, comes in the proper use of dimension 16, or the proper conception or channeling of dimension 16, in terms of how you can reference yourself utilizing dimension 16, or conceptualizing it. Dimension 16 is a kind of extroverted feeling. Anyway, I must at some point publish the updated sort of components of the 16 of the 17 dimensions. But anyway, okay. What's my point here? So what's also interesting is that all dimension 14 does is support rajas. Okay, now, well, what's more interesting is to actually talk about, when I say that, there are 4 elements in each guna. The 4 elements that I use, I code them in terms of the alchemical elements, the four elements. So there's earth, there's fire, there's water, and there's air. So it's just interesting then that the spirit symbolizes water, and the water symbolizes the second dimension, which is spirit, symbolizes water, and the 4th dimension, which I often refer to as the water, as the doctrinal phrase, the water, but in the alchemical element, it's actually the air. The 4th dimension is actually an alchemical air element, but it is also the water. So the water is actually the air in the alchemical sort of conception of things, and the spirit is the water. And uh, and in the four elements of the alchemical thing, it's very, very simple. It's that water is the thing that sustains life, that you drink. Um, uh, I should have. Earth is like food that builds you and gives you. A fire is like motivation or intention, and the air is atmosphere. Is I think it also sort of connotates to the weather uh, and to wind, but it's whether or not something is I mean, the weather doesn't often stop you from doing things, but it can make it easier or harder, or sort of if you have the wind at your back, if there's enough, sort of is it full of smoke, or is it sort of hospitable, or is it inviting, or is it so it sets the atmosphere, it sets the but it's nice when it's temperate, perhaps, because then you're free to do whatever you want, or sometimes what you want to do needs a very particular kind of weather, depending, I guess, on how specialized it is, and how rigorous it is, or how sort of complex and sophisticated, or so you're doing something quite with a lot of artifice, with a lot that it it's on I mean, there's some things that I mean, if you build a dam, you have to know that it rains there quite often, the weather, the wind and the atmosphere brings these things. So anyway, that's perhaps too ethereal a metaphor, but anyway, so anyway, so the spirit is, firstly, it's one of those things that are supported by the Father, the 16th dimension, and it's the thing that is witnessing in the earth that represents sattva. It's also supported by the 11th dimension, which is the Holy Ghost. So the sattvic elements are between the 11th and the 14th dimension, which means that they are supported by the 11th, and they are supported by the 16th in terms of 1 and 2, because 1 and 2 and 12 and 13 are sattvic elements. Anyway, so it goes from the 16th dimension and the 11th dimension. And the thing that is pointed out there is that the second dimension is one of the ones that are especially named. And then the fourth dimension is the representative of Rajas. It's supported by the third dimension, and also Rajas is also supported by the 14th dimension, as the two elements of the final five, which support the Rajasic elements. So it's 3 and 14, and the thing that bears witness in the earth is well, I call it the water, but it's an air element. And then the blood represents tamas, and the blood is one of the final five itself. So it really is one of the is almost more special than the other ones. And the interesting thing is that if if you look at the alchemical things that I've just pointed out, that the spirit is water and the water is air, then the blood needs to represent, to have a full set, needs to represent fire and earth. And well, I mean, it's interesting as well that these three things are supposed to agree in one, and the Trinity, which is mentioned, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, are one. So I think that these can be seen as very special nodes, and the only reason why I'm talking about this is because I think it corresponds nicely with the seven spirits of God, and it's because then you have seven things. You have dimension 2, dimension 4, dimension 7, dimension 11, dimension 14, dimension 16, and dimension 3. 2, 3, 4, 7, 11, 14, 16. But if you really just want to get a handle, I think, on your own psyche, you kind of have to understand how those things in the flow diagrams that I almost just dictated, that in terms of that dimension 2 is supported by dimension 16 and dimension 11 in terms of the subvark elements, that dimension 4 is supported by dimension 3 and dimension 14, and then you just take 2 and 4 as being representative of those things, and then you combine it with dimension 7, and you've got the witnesses lined up that need to sort of be properly recording things, and how they are networked and routed in coordination with the other dimensions, in terms of that there are these special resonances within the 17 model that for example, the subvark is 1, 2, and 12 and 13, and that they are specially supported by dimension 11 and dimension 16 as the final 5 that are holding up their respective or let's say containing those respective, holding them within their purview, within their awareness, sort of ambit within their and that is nicely summarized into just dimension 2 in terms of what is described as a witness in the earth. Anyway, I mean, you could say, those that bear record in heaven and those that bear witness in the earth. I mean, is itself a kind of dualism, which is perhaps useful because it's helping you also to navigate that very fractious, what I was talking about before, about those tamasic things where you get dislodged from your own blood, and also how sort of the end of the earth and the beginning of heaven, between dimensions 8 and dimensions 9, that you have to have what is bound up, one of the characteristics and the features of the Spirit of the Lord, that what is bound up on earth is bound up in heaven, and what is loosed on earth is loosened in heaven, in terms of the spiritual activity of the Spirit of the Lord, which is the spirit of knowledge and understanding, and also the magnification of the Lord, which is really consonant with being anointed of God, which is also what the word Christ means, anointed. But yeah, anyway, this is more important for just having an internally regulated um, internal locus of control, but also sort of how these things this particular distinction is essentially probably just a very useful pedagogical, sort of way of conceiving or partitioning these things so that they can be orderly in their treatment. Anyway, so it's sort of like the roadmap for clear thinking, or at least some description of it. In terms of understanding the understanding of God and eternal life and things like that, but within in some sense, I haven't been talking about those concepts because, apart from the Trinity, I'm talking about it in a much more psychological working, in terms of how your workings are. That's in the book of life. It's not about your works; it's about your workings, the themes, the spiritual discerning of how these things are actually coming together to form the actual quality and condition of your purpose, in some sense. Anyways, these are sort of quite ephemeral and delicate, sort of distinctions to draw between one's own internal schema and yeah, I just went through a whole discussion with someone where I was explaining a model about how to sort of review your own schema and sort of be aware of your conscious, deliberate choice making. Which I don't know if I want to get into the re-explanation of that. I don't know if it's that pertinent to this, but and it might be a good description of how one is treating the karmic components, the objects in the mind, in a way that clearly holds the final five as sort of being, or especially the 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 Trinity, as sort of having a clear purview over choices that are in regulating the sort of the flow of mental activity and decision making, and of being lost in that kind of sequential process that always sort of karmically has no terminal point unless it's directed from. Sometimes I don't even think it can necessarily even have a terminal point, except if it is sort of contained within a sort of a loop that someone is willing to take responsibility for forming that loop, and for saying that that loop is good enough and motivating for that, or being willing to sort of substantiate that. And in some sense the substantiation can never, you can always hypothetically imagine a never-ending argument about it that doesn't make it, it doesn't falsify it. Anyway, I don't necessarily want to resolve that that problem, because I mean, essentially it's going to be a bit of a tangent, but well, anyway, perhaps I should just to prove that it's not a fatal defect, and that it can be repudiated and refuted, is that if you create more substantiations that are themselves similarly self-consistent and grounded, and the only accusation against you is essentially an open-ended, sort of fudged, hypothetical accusation. Oh, sorry, that's not, those aren't meant to be one case, those are meant to be separate cases. So, either that it's fudged or it's hypothetical. That or it's open-ended. That, sort of, you're the idea that you can't satisfy an inductive argument that is itself not provably self-consistent. It's just a kind of, it's just a test, it's just a query, it's just a kind of unfounded, sort of concern. I mean, sometimes curious doubt might have some basis in good faith, but and it might be a curious thing to go and investigate and indulge into, but sort of the non-resolution of that kind of project is again the entertainment of that kind of skeptical concern. It's I mean, I guess you will end up having to create some description of the obstacle that is being posed, and in some sense, now you've got a sort of a hypothetical problem to be solved. You're dealing with a generalization. In some sense, you're actually dealing with a what generalizations need to be is they need to have a certain clarity about them. They can't just be fragmentary. They have to actually have. They can't just. They can't connotate and be suggestive in a kind of haphazard or sort of incomplete, sort of fragmentary, or I'm trying to find the word that starts with a D, that has a kind of corrosive, disintegrating, sort of attitude disguised within its, so-called naivety, or sort of innocent, sort of curiosity. But it must actually be a full-fledged moderating um, sort of, I'll just say something. I'll try and make a generic construct. It must be a proper moderating, sort of yeah, I guess I haven't dealt with philosophy around Dimension 4 for a long time, but I was, because I want to use a word, and if I use this word, I'm going to have to elaborate it, because otherwise it's just going to be embarrassing. But it has to be a proper moderating tendency. And I mean, that sounds a bit strange already, I guess, but man, this is getting deeper down a rabbit hole. But anyway, I think I've given some philosophical outline as to why it's not serious to indulge in skeptical sort of debasement. What's the other? I have another thread that I was even talking about. I don't think so. Anyway, dimension 2, dimension 4, dimension 7. Oh, I was talking about, perhaps talking about yeah. So I mean, yeah, I don't know if this is actually germane at all, but I don't really think it is. Anyway, I've got too much background noise to easily continue anyway. Okay, this is an addendum that makes me wish that I had waited longer before making the first recording. But anyway, I guess I had to start somewhere. So I've made already a slight refinement. I think it is necessary to divide 16 into two. So I call it 16T and 16S. 16T standing for tamas, so that would just be how dimension 16, the father, supports dimension 17. So I call 16's support of 17 16T, and then 16's support of dimension 1 and 2 is 16S. So that is the only dimension that supports that's one of the final five that supports two gunas. So I can't find an easy way to pronounce this. I haven't worked out the jargon to say it, but I do have the distinction now that essentially, so the alchemical elements of each guna only has 4 dimensions, but tones, emotional tones that pertain to each guna are comprised of 2 sets. So I've said this already, that sort of rajas emotional tones are comprised of sattva and rajas. Sattvaic emotional tones are comprised of sattva elements and tamas elements, and tamasic emotional tones are comprised of tamasic elements and rajasic elements, the alchemical elements. And anyway, so what's interesting is how these elements are also dispersed within the 17 model. So now this is much more neat and tidy now that I've divided 16 into 16S and 16T, because then basically dimensions 1 and 2 are supported by 16S, and then dimensions 4, 5, and 6 are supported by dimension 3, and 4, 5, and 6 are rajasic elements. So and 1 and 2 are sattvaic elements. So 16S supports 2 sattvaic elements. 3 supports dimension 3 supports 3 rajasic elements. Dimension 7 supports 3 tamasic elements. So it goes in the order from dimension 1. It goes sattva, rajas, tamas, which is interesting because that is also the order in which in the Hindu scriptures they are mentioned. But I believe that it's mentioned sattva, rajas, tamas. Maybe I should double check that actually. But anyway, and then dimension 11 supports 2 sattvaic elements. Dimension 14 supports 1 rajasic element, and dimension 16T supports 1 tamasic element. And so it's interesting that that pattern repeats itself, that 16S supports 1 and 2, 3 support, or in terms of, so 16S as it's supporting 1 and 2 is supporting sattva, 3 is supporting rajas, and 7 is supporting tamas, and then 11 is supporting sattva, 14 is supporting rajas, and 16T is supporting tamas. So it goes sattva, rajas, tamas, and then again sattva, rajas, tamas. So sadly, I haven't worked out any deeper significance here, to work out how these elements would naturally. I mean, in some sense, it makes sense that because this pattern repeats itself, that their neighbors are. So, for example, sattva is a combination of tamas and sattva. So it seems that and tamas and sattva do border each other in the sequence. I mean, there are only three groupings in the sequence. So in some sense, because it's a repeating pattern, they all border each other, but it seems that the pattern of elemental commingling is always, it seems, relying on the earlier. So, for example, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas, Sattva, Rajas, Tamas. So that the Sattvic dimensions, or elements 1 and 2, are sort of commingling with 17, which is a tamasic element. And the Sattvic elements that are supported by dimension 11 are immediately proceed after the tamasic elements supported by dimension 7. Eight, 9, and 10 are tamasic elements. So it looks like that when you're in a particular dimension, sort of the context of the immediately preceding element of the final 5 sort of is the border of elements that sort of get pooled into your functioning is the immediately preceding group. The only weird place that seems weird is how 16S is commingling with 16T, because that is, that's that weird asymmetrical point where there is actually a difference between an old cycle and a new cycle, because you're starting at dimension 1, and somehow the only connection that those two dimensions are going to have with tamas is if you take from the old cycle and then commingle it with the tamas as the bordering neighbor. And I would almost say that the only way that you can sort of, well, it's interesting because what I'm trying to do is I'm not doing it very well, but I'm trying to sort of paint the picture in some form of abstraction about what allows this 17 model to have like a fractal nature, that it is always unfolds into the next sequence of 17 model, that it sort of regenerates itself, that it sort of has an eternal dynamism within it, and in some sense the uniqueness here that almost helps me to sound like I'm not making up ad hoc rules is that 16 is already the most asymmetrical dimension of the final 5, because it supports 2 gunas, and then the break point between those 2 gunas is what actually determines the beginning of a new cycle. But they are supported by the same identity of the final 5, or component of the final 5, which is the father. And so this 16th dimension really does have a hand in the first and second dimension. Really does have this heavenly father has is the conceiver, is the contemplative, sort of sustainer of that furnishes the content of the first and second dimension. just out of interest, or I mean, I'm talking about Sadvaic emotional tone. So I guess what I'm almost saying is, I don't know if I should read out the Sadvaic emotional tones when I haven't properly reverse engineered this yet, but so let me see if there are particular. No, I don't think there is a particular emotional tone that is particularly representative of 16S and 16T, but I can name the emotional tones that are connected with 16T. Those are just annoyed and worried. Yeah. And then ones that are connected to 16S are Dimension 1, angry and confused, and Dimension 2 is elated and scared. Anyway, I guess none of this is quite profound, but and I guess it's interesting that 16. That's interesting to some degree that there was no overlap in any of those tones. What's interesting is the odd one out, perhaps. The odd one out is connected to hope and liberty, which is Dimension 12 and Dimension 9, which are related to each other in terms of their adjacency, in terms of their neighboring relationship. So it's interesting that most of the commingling you can't say most of the commingling because some of the other elements of the other half of those elemental tones are one comes from the annoyed and worried is faith and tranquility, which is 13 and 17, and elated and scared is 2 and Dimension 8. The reason why 2 emotional tones have both of those is because emotional tones aren't just constructed out of 2 emotional tones that are both present. They actually have a weird relationship to one another. They have an inflection, and that inflection takes one of 2 characteristics. That either the one because these are Sattvaic emotional tones, I derived that which I'm still need to reverse engineer, that all the emotional tones are based in one of the 4 Sattvaic elements, and then somehow I worked out that there are only particular cross-pollinations with these 4 elements. And that, for instance, angry and confused is instinct and trust, which is dimension instinct is dimension 1 and trust is dimension 10. And so the first element, because these are Sattvaic emotional tones, will always be instinct, placidity, faith, or liberty. And then the second element from tamas that only has a particular correspondence to each of these things. They don't sort of they only have a particular correspondence to each of the Vark elements, and one thing that can happen is either that particular relationship will the Sadvaic element will overshadow the Tamasic element. It will displace it, or it will fuel it. So I call these generally, I just worked out technical definitions for them. They're either sort of constructive or negatory, or negatory. In the technical language, angry is experiencing a sense of what things will be like, distinguished by a stronger sense of what those things would be like. Yeah, because I'm phrasing this in the subjective first person, would is not defined as what shall be, it's defined as things what would be like. That's a sort of a grammatical, artful modulation. I don't want to talk about that too much because it's a tangent, but and confused is experiencing a sense of what things will be like, distinguished by an absent sense of what those things would be like. So confused is dimension 1 with the absence of dimension 10, and angry is dimension 1 with the exacerbation of dimension 10 fueled by dimension 1. So it's a kind of that the dimension 10 is becoming a subordinate reflection of dimension 1, whereas the confused is an experience of the first dimension with an agnostic or a missed sense of the other element. And what can I say about this? I don't want to get into this sort of technical tangent, but I mean, I used to have elaborate ways of talking about this, which I haven't familiarized myself with for a long time. But there is also another, I think, thing that basically happens with these kinds of emotional tones that, man, what is it? It's not such a hard concept. I need to find my notes. I was just writing about something. I was writing about something similar to this. Oh yeah, so it could also manifest, tones like these I think could manifest as a kind of imposed stillness against others, or a kind of antagonism on the level of the flow of that particular element. So if someone tries to use that element in another emotional tone, it could essentially be an affront to the use of that emotional tone. So man, I can't even remember all my old terminology, but there's a kind of there's a feng shui that essentially all the negative tones have a kind of trump against them. So it's interesting that for example, angry and confused have a connection like this, where essentially there might be a kind of internal balance between angry and confused, where angry will actually hold a charge, which can at some point, that charge has a certain potential for confused. And if it is converted into confused, then it can be countermanded or traded or exchanged or sort of opposed by one of the countervailing sort of maneuvers that counter it. And then after that's countered, then somebody else can in some sense accumulate that karmic charge and place it into their sort of their reserve in terms of if they have an internal balance. And it's interesting that structurally, oh man, I've forgotten the stuff, but within metagram circuitries, uh, there is a weird relationship in one's own internal circuitry between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response, where there is an internal digestion happening between the primary counteroffer refers to the inferior function in oh, this is going to be embarrassing if I say the wrong thing. I don't know why it's always tricky for me to picture this in my head. The primary counteroffer is the superego parent function and the unconscious parent function both meeting in the theater of the subconscious inferior function. Surely that's right. Yeah, that must be right. Which is obviously also the base of the unconscious side of the mind. The subconscious inferior function is the base of the unconscious side of the mind. And so that theater is housing a particular emotional tone, and then the emergent response is the oath and the worship, which is the primary counteroffer is the most sort of is the strangest of the things, because the primary counteroffer emanates from two separate parent functions, where all the others emanate from a single parent function, but lead to two different inferior functions, whereas the primary counteroffer is the opposite to that. But the emergent response is must be the subconscious parent function leading to the ego is the, that sounds like the worship. Let me just get the diagram. Yes, the subconscious parent function performs the worship in the ego's inferior function, and the ego's own parent function leading its own base, which is the unconscious inferior function, is the oath. So the emergent response is how the ego is leading the subconscious. That's one way of summarizing the emergent response. And it's hard to even describe the primary counteroffer, because the primary counteroffer is the combination of the unconscious parent function and the superego parent function, as it is expressed in the subconscious inferior function or the unconscious base. Uh, uh, um, and so there are two parent functions involved in that, and the thing is that the super ego parent function can do it whatever the fuck it wants to its base, because its base is the sin of the ego. It's not the inferior function of the ego, so it doesn't even have to modulate itself in any kind of relay with the ego parent function. The super ego's parent function is unaccountable to the ego's parent function, but it gets to dictate things to the ego. It has a one-way sort of communication or flow with the ego. So the unconscious parent function is really capable of doing whatever it wants to the answer. The answer and the prayer are both the components that make up the primary counter offer, and the prayer can do whatever it wants with the answer, and the answer has no recourse to the ego, but it has no recourse that gets mediated by the ego, but it can do whatever the hell it wants to the ego. So whatever the prayer does, however the answer is treated by the prayer, the parent function in the superego can just project that as the sin of the ego. So or in terms of the primary counter offer, I think I need to clear it up in my own mind, but it is a very important thread of one's psychological schema. It's almost like sort of the unconscious thread of one's own sanity. I name each metagram circuit after their primary counter offer because I consider it to be one of the most characteristic facets of a metagram circuit, because of this involvement of two parent functions. But in my view, the primary counter offer is only ever a single emotional tone. The emergent response and the stimulus both can contain two emotional tones. But in my view, actually, I'll have to check my notes about that. There might have been a naming convention, but I believe that I theoretically derived that the primary counter offer only has a single or solitary emotional tone, and and yeah, I mean, I do think that without that pillar, or I mean, look, just because it has a single emotional tone doesn't mean it can't be disrupted. The answer in the prayer can't sort of misalign and misfire and essentially not sort of cohese into the kind of circuit that it's in. But it's a very strange circuit because it's more like a piece of string that loops around, and the two ends that aren't connected are slightly are adjacent to one another, are close to one another, and in some sense there has to be a kind of anyway, my conception of the work of the crucifixion is is forging the connection of that disconnected circuit, which is something like an act of faith. That's also an oversimplification, but I don't want to go down that tangent since I've got lots of recordings talking about that. But those two parts that come together, I call the question and the only itself. That what the superego is doing to the ego is, which is establishing the base of the superego, that is only itself, that is the solipsistic theta prelingual dreamlike state of the infant, that is this kind of metaphysical cloud of procedural activity where there is no man, I can't remember the word, sort of what's the word that means sort of your sort of pre-verb, not when I say verbal, I mean verb, pre-verb, that the world itself is, you are just part of the happening of an environmental, sort of, I can't remember the technical word, it's in some developmental psychological literature. Anyway, but the question is actually what your monologue is in the way that you can consciously direct your thoughts to make to propitiate actual contemplative thought and narrate in your own mind. That is the question. And I call it the question and in some sense the question is kind of extraneous because it's not connected with the only itself. It's not connected with the superego, the base of the superego's. In fact, the base of the superego is the sin of the ego, and so the question itself, if it abrogates responsibility for the sin of the ego, which it will generally regard as the sin of the world, it won't take responsibility for it because it is happening to the ego from the environment, from the superego. But if the question does take responsibility for the superego, it can import the sin of the ego onto the inferior function of the ego and commingle it in the question, and then you have a virtual connection of the circuit, and that might give latitude in the primary counter offer, which in my view is the most stale arm and facet, and is very much connected with the idea in Revelations of the woman and the dragon that flies off to have a child, because the unconscious parent function, being the woman, is the mother of the someone says is the mother of the ego, because the question, so much as that it is naive and sort of I can't think of the correct poetical word, but it's something like diverted by the mysteries of life and indulgent into a kind of ever a question that has to burden itself with the content of the ego is the form that that question takes is the, let's say, the cutting edge of independent sustenance that is being fed to the ego from the independent structure of of the false ego complex, which I generally conceive as of I generally, when I say the false ego complex, I'm referring to the subconscious, the unconscious, and the ego, and not the superego, because I consider that the superego to fundamentally be the source, or the first. Uh, what's the point? And how the superego was sort of downloaded into the perspectival framework of the ego, just so that it could set up a propositional structure in the subconscious belief structure, and start compiling its own system of knowing, uh, grounded in its sort of its propositional utility to its own sort of sense of its own being, and in some sense the kind of the natural identity, that at the same time that that was happening, uh, the unconscious, hmm, yeah, I mean, it might also be that the real mark of independence from the superego is how the unconscious develops. Anyway, and how then that unconscious is digested into the subconscious, as well. I guess it's slightly unfair that in my mind I have this modeled in a very fudged way that, sort of the subconscious is really the only true brain, and that the superego is actually a kind of metaphysical milieu that is being sort of that is haunting the brain, and that the ego perspective is, is almost an emergent property perhaps as well. But I mean, it could also just be that these are all just structures in the brain, sort of that the ego is prefrontal cortex and the unconscious is, sort of limbic or something. I don't know enough about brain physiology, and I don't particularly care to know either, but essentially, yeah, it could be essentially both, as I almost said, that these could all just be the subconscious and the parts of the subconscious that govern with corresponding to these parts, and my metaphysical rendition is perhaps more accurate, but that the subconscious can be habitualized into certain states of the unconscious, and the ego being emergent, and the unconscious, in fact, also including what did I just say that the unconscious was? I don't think I did actually describe it that well. That I said that the superego is metaphysical, but the unconscious is also weirdly both embodied, but also within a certain band of dimensions and subject matter, but it's sort of externalized. It's sort of, I mean, I do think that this is also slightly awkward because I'm using words which are, sort of used by other people, and I mean them in very particular ways. Because it does seem to me that the unconscious is something like context in the purest abstract form of context, which is a reference that is needed probably for the subconscious, for most, as at least a correlating datum. It could be that the unconscious is something like the chemical neurotransmitters, and the subconscious is the sort of the potential library that also, I mean, it's interesting that there are, I mean, Penrose has gone into this as well, but I think that without boiling the quantum pot, without actually collapsing the waveform, you can read your library just by the or let's say the content of the library has an effect on one's thinking because of the Penrose has described this, or I mean, I'm kind of metaphysically espousing it slightly, maybe, that the range within which a particular neuron can fire, or whatever the word is, dendrite or whatever, the range of sensitivity that would, because the thing either, it's not it's never deterministic if something fires or not. It's kind of within a range of probability, which is somewhat correspondent to sort of the amount of voltage and the sort of and the sensitivity. And that sensitivity is sort of correspondent to how big an area, and I can't remember any of this terminology, but and what's the word, tolerance, or sort of, how that particular tolerance band so you have a kind of relative network that has within it an array of sort of probabilistic tendencies to fire from a certain cascading process that was initiated by some particular, I would think of it as a kind of epiphenomenological event of an emergent, perspectival framing and impetus, and that emergent framework is essentially you can kind of imagine it as being the overlay that is physically that the physical substrate of that overlay is the mechanism that I've just described. Is that you're interfacing with that a network of sensitivity and probability, which is like a subconscious library that is being that has a holographic projection within one's emergent subjective phenomenological perspectival ego state of the judgment that you have, and that your contemplative conscious sort of frame the container of your consciousness, so I mean, it's hard because it's hard to describe. It's hard to delineate the frame of one's consciousness, or to explain it, because you never experience it as a frame. You just experience it as the contents of the container, because there doesn't seem to be anything else other than the container, which is what leads some people towards, sort of philosophic solipsism. Anyway, okay, so we all have brains, and some of us we can believe because we see people have their own sort of iterative ability to reframe their own perspective. They seem to be as intelligent and spirited and consciously agentic as we are, and the realm in which that we are participating is the unconscious. And I can't remember, but I do have, a long time ago, when I was still working on Metagram, and this is a bit of a stupid thing to not be able to remember, but I remember thinking, these emotional tones, they all exist in one side of the mind. They don't actually, that it's how the one side of the mind sees all the other sides of the mind. And so I even remember toying with the idea that the emotional tones all had some kind of neurochemical, potentially a neurochemical substrate. I think it might be slightly more strange than that, because I think it's actually it's more it's broader than that. In some sense, it's more abstract than that, but it's also more visceral and real than that. That it's something like everything in the unconscious realm as the participatory context, which would be a way of saying that that if you have this perspective and you have this brain, you have this emergent phenomena of a perspective, of a frame of perspective, and you have a brain, which is this library. And then you have a context between these two, between the propositional and the perspective, that two things are participating, or one thing is participating. It could be cashed out as a monist version of determinism or fatalism, or you could construct a dualism out of it and to be sophisticated. I think that you would have to have some kind of dualist I think that the monism in some sense runs aground also because you end up having to reduce everything into a kind of super ego solipsism. And so in some sense the unconsciousness itself is already a kind of superseding what's the word, competitive context to the superego, which is fundamentally solipsistic. And having to, and in some sense I don't think one is right and one is wrong. You have to find a way to synthesize them and so the superego is something like your own private solipsistic bubble. It's kind of like your a priori origin story, and the unconscious side of the mind is the arrival in a universe that is and I don't know how to frame this properly, so I'm just going to have to sort of rush into it and apply some brute force. That the universe is a kind of it's either inhabited by meat machines, or it's inhabited by absurdity, or it's inhabited by things that very carefully bring you back to the need to developing a first philosophy of emerging from your superego and into the unconscious in a way in which you order the mystery of the unconscious into something that's hopefully less generic than mystery and more sophisticated than merely fatalism or determinism or some other kind of monism, but into something like a dualism that supports freedom and choice. And then I think you basically need to look at Vasti Ruurt's work on living with nihilism in the book on nihilism, which is the correct synthesis of the first philosophy that was not directly distilled by Nietzsche himself. He expressed something profound, but it required secondary refinement to bring it into the picture. Okay. Okay, I haven't made any useful work in what the emotional tones are, but I did get into the idea that they are really resident in the unconscious. Which might, I actually named each metagram circuit, or no, rather I should say, I named each metatype after their unconscious dominant function. That's what makes me a metatype 13, is that the dominant function of my unconscious side of the mind is dimension 13. It could be that I mean, I always thought that that held the key to people's inception or lack of development would all be thematically related to that dimension, would all be sort of being uh, being stuck in an arrested development on a theme that correlates to that dimension. And that, in some sense, all of a person's problems would be thematically, would sort of, would quite safely be reducible to that dimension. Um, in terms of relating it to their context, not relating it to their perspective, not relating it to the propositional or the perspectival or the procedural, but relating it to the participatory, it would relate to that, which is interesting because then I wonder if that could be a general rule that someone's, because I must say I haven't even reverse engineered. I mean, my understanding of metagram at this time is very embarrassing, but I have not yet reverse engineered why some metatypes have a Rajasic subtype, a Tamasic subtype, and a Tamasic subtype, and others only have two of the three, and some even have more than one of the same. They have two Tamasic variants, and they have two Rajasic and one Sattva. You know, like why do some metatypes have this and not that? And it might be that there is an irregular, because the emotional tones themselves are not perfectly symmetrical with each other, which I haven't reverse engineered, but looking at that work that I've done, and it might be that something in the unconscious side of the mind, one of the elements in the unconscious side of the mind is perhaps the maybe that is what settles first, perhaps, to make someone a metatype, is when they when someone, because I do believe that people are metatypes before they are metagrams, that they aren't always a metagram type. They develop their metagram type, although that might also need some revision when I make further progress. But that it's when the unconscious settles on a particular circuitry, which perhaps is all decided after the primary counter offer is kind of coalesces. And if it is the primary counter offer that emerges first, and then everything else is set against that, it might be that the emotional tone of the primary counter offer is always, maybe it's either connected with the superego and the unconscious, or maybe just the unconscious. Well, if it was in my case, it definitely wouldn't involve the superego. It would only involve the unconscious, because my superego is all Rajasic, and my Rajasic elements, and my unconscious is all Sattvic elements. And obviously, Sattvic elements would correspond with well, if I'm to believe my notes without reverse engineering them, there are three variants of my metatype, and there's one of each. There's one of Sattva, there's one of Rajas, and there's one of Tamas. So to incorporate both, it would have to be a combination of the superego and the unconscious, so that... Anyway, this is not fun playing this, so that it could be any of them, because obviously Sattvic emotional tones are... Sattvic elements are connected to both Rajasic emotional tones and Sattvic emotional tones, and the Rajasic emotional elements in my superego are connected obviously to Rajas and also to Tamas. because tamas emotional tones are constructed from rajas emotional tones and tamas emotional tones. I mean, this has always been a finicky thing that it was always too complicated for me earlier in my process to even consider thinking about, because I didn't have enough theoretical mass to survey yet. But the thing that is uh, has stopped me before, which is, this is going to be like a big brain thing to try to surmount, is that that some metagram circuits in some metatypes are going to have a particular profile that I mean, I have this inkling, this is not proven yet, but I have this very, very deep suspicion that it must be, from my theory of typology and my models of typology, it must be determinable that certain subtypes will naturally occur as being super-ego focused or subconscious focused or unconscious focused or ego focused or super-ego focused, or will have some obvious natural predilection or tendency in order to tend towards that kind of presentation. And that, I think, might be somewhat related to how the metatype dimensions line up with how the final five, sort of neighborhoods are positioned within the structure, and how the particular emotional tones that animate that metagram type, where they are found, are in terms of the primary counter offer. Is it made out of the superego, or is it made out of the unconscious? Which element is it gravitating around, and which elements is it makes it up, and then looking at the elemental deconstruction of people's metagram circuit, of the components of their emotional tones within their metagram circuitry, and then looking at where their superego, subconscious, unconscious, and ego are positioned within the metatype, will give you a particular answer as to a kind of natural tendency of internal focus within the false ego complex. It would also give you clues to kind of structural behavior within the false ego complex. The problem is that these relationships might be so subtle that and many of these correlations might be so discrete that they are simply sometimes not worth rendering into full resolution. But obviously explorations must be made in order to fully make sure that there is no secret avenue that doesn't yield, particularly useful either therapeutic or other forms of I mean, I guess, other forms of usefulness to be had. Things like that might lead to a breakthrough in what's the word? Psychometrics, in terms of being able to induct people into finding what their type is, etc., etc. Anyway, okay, I think I've pontificated enough about this. Okay, I'm going to delve back into my psychology. I haven't really done much work on it, but I haven't made much progress on it, at least, since last I made a recording. But this is slightly embarrassing, at least. But just listening to a recording that John Vervaeke was in, I think I've switched up or mixed up or at least his use of propositional and perspectival, and I want to explain and excuse my mistake, and then also assert the revision of it, because it is a mistake that I made. So I before said that the subconscious was propositional and the ego was perspectival, and now I think those must be swapped. And I mean, the reason why I made this mistake is because my ontology is that the ego develops first and seeds the subconscious, as in it plants and sets up the subconscious. It inculcates the growth of the subconscious, and in some sense, I was even defining the subconscious as being, in some sense, propositions that get libraried, that get booked into a library, that end up populating a library. But when one is actually conceiving of propositions, I guess you're doing that in the ego. And so, it's because these things end up being on a kind of epistemological, on an epistemological level, they end up being deeply, the one grounds the other, and vice versa. So the propositional gets put into sets, and those sets structure one's perspective. So I'd like to think that this, what's the word? What's the word that means that you don't get indicted because you've been exculpated? Is that the word, exculpation? Or that might mean the opposite of what I wanted, because I've got the prefix wrong. But I think I have pleaded my my case well enough to get away with that mistake. And this also has to do with the relationship that the agency of the subconscious performs in the theater that is the base of the ego. What did I just say? So the agency. So if I swap the terms now, if I said that the subconscious is the perspectival and the ego is the propositional, the agency of the perspectival is the base of the propositional, and the agency of the propositional performs in the theater that is the base of the perspectival subconscious. Okay, so I think that revision is a useful one. Obviously, it's ideal not to have revisions, because then you never run into confusions over switching around one's own labels of things and jargon that I have now put in verbal recordings. So hopefully that revision is not too confusing. Perspectival. Okay. Anyway, it was a rather recent layer of description that I added to my already existing model, so it's not. And so, but anyway, the interesting thing though is that the I was thinking that it's, well, if you call the ego the propositional, then what's interesting is how the question, which is what I call the unconscious's or the participatory sense of agency. Actually, I must think maybe those are also worth switching around, but between the unconscious and the superego. But anyway, I do have this tendency where I it's very hard to work out naming conventions for things, because you don't know if you should frame it from the subjective percipient or if you should sort of describe it from the third person. Basically, if you should describe it on the level of a kind of sociological phenomena that's like sort of more natural to third person reports in one's because communication itself is in some sense rooted in that perspective, because it's also a kind of political, no, I didn't want to say political, but it's a cultural mediation, a culture of meaning ascription and salience and pertinence, you know, sort of conventionality, because without conventions you don't have, you can't sustain a language, because you need some way to, you need some hollow structure that you can use to indicate that you can use as a medium to communicate a more subtle or discrete nuance of context, and you know, in some sense, you know, this is all very strange, because when you get into discussing very deep philosophical things, you have to sort of define your whole terms, and you have to anchor this to some kind of phenomenological self-perception that you can sort of artfully describe well enough that somebody else can attempt to reproduce, you know, sort of your empirical phenomenological. That's at least if you're dealing with, you know, very deep philosophical matters that are very much based in psychological properties and such. Anyway, anyway, this is part of the reason why I'm sort of a little, for the thing that I just said is part of why I'm slightly annoyed with myself, that, you know, it's not nice not having these things perfectly worked out in terms of what the primary counter offer is, what is the answer, what is the prayer, and essentially the answer in the prayer is very much connected with the question and the only itself. Which is in some sense the most, or it's literally called, it's how the unconscious is connected to the superego. It is the most shadowed and unaware tenant of what I call the false ego complex. And you see, the question is on the other, is emanating from the unconscious parent function, which is essentially the most agentic aspect of the unconscious side of the mind. And it's issuing the question, which is being housed in the theater of the ego's inferior function. And on the other side of that, the parent function is the parent function of the unconscious side of the mind is leading its own side of the mind by leading its base through the prayer. So it is the same thing that performs the prayer is issuing the question, and that question is being performed in the ego, in the propositional, as a question. So anyway, the jargon lines up nicely, but you know, it's the weirdest thing is like, well, what is this prayer? What is this answer? And the answer is issued on the other side of the superego's parent function. So the superego has to produce an answer that is performed in the inferior function of the subconscious, which is the base of the unconscious side of the mind, which is led by the prayer. So the superego has to produce an answer, but it also produces what I call the only itself, which is the projection of sin against the ego, which is also its own base. So it's leading itself with the only itself. So it is, I believe the only itself is another way of saying something. It is a particular God of the world sort of thing. The only itself is being performed in what I even call the terminal beast, because it is the condition upon which the whole false ego intrinsically rests within the superego. Which is, in some sense, there's a mirror reflection of this in some way to a few things within the ego, but can be thematically maybe seen as being reflected in the oath, how the ego has to leave, because the oath has to, because in some sense the only itself is the kind of, that is the deepest epistemology of the false ego complex, is the only itself. That is the full-blown beast, as it were. That is the first death. And in some sense that is disguised because the question actually believes that it is initiating the whole process, that it is the first mover. So there's a split epistemology, but I would say that the deeper epistemology really is the superego parent function that is also tasked with producing this answer, which eventually flows into the unconscious parent function performing the question, because that is the same circuit. So the superego parent function, the unconscious parent function, they are connected together through the primary counter offer and what I call the condonation, which is the question and the only itself. So, the real question is, it's like a chicken and the egg. Is it the superego parent function, or is it the unconscious parent function? And somehow the answer is it's both. That they are sort of reflections of the same thing, but in some sense the superego happens first, but the unconscious really has to believe that it happened first. And so, yeah, there is, and they do this because they both share the same inferior function. Well, it's they both share the subconscious inferior function. They are both parent functions are sharing the same theater. In the answer and the prayer is being shared in the same theater, which is the subconscious inferior function. This is all happening, in the inferior function of the perspectival. The inferior function of the perspectival. So that is why it's called the shadow, I guess, or why you even get these words like superego and unconscious. And so your superego and unconscious are fighting over the shadow, the inferior function of your perspectival subconscious. Okay, so that makes sense, but it's still, it's weird because as soon as if you unlock this thread, you really are reducing yourself into a kind of belief automaton, and you're like, well, I really am quite pathological and crazy. Like, if you actually were to look at the content of this negotiation in the shared performance, in this inferior function of the subconscious, you would really say, yeah, this is a false ego. This is the secret meeting that is the committee of establishing and designing the false ego. This is the hidden truth within the false drama and mechanism itself. That is the this is like this is the cognitive dissonance that is hidden away, that keeps the personality schema functioning and running within the false ego complex. Okay, so and the parent function in the unconscious I call the woman, and I link it to the dragon and the woman that fly away for the new child to be born, because it can give rise to a new ego. The woman has the power through the question, through controlling the content of the question, and also by getting the question to burden the only itself, then the condemnation stops being the condemnation of the false ego complex and starts being the condemnation of a new personality and a new being. Sort of because it completes the circuit in the inferior function of the ego and the sin of the ego, which have to merge. So you have to make the inferior function of the ego take on the sin of the ego, or absorb it or amalgamate it. So you have to have some kind of importation and exportation, so that there is some kind of integral amalgamation between the inferior function and the sin of the ego, because the sin of the ego is also the base of the superego, or I sometimes call the base of each side of the mind the death, because it is a kind of conditionality which is required in order to have some kind of matrix stability foundation for everything else to function on. You have to have a base that doesn't move, that's atrophied, that's frozen in some condition or state. But the condition of the sin in the ego is in a different scale to the sins of the other, because it just grows. It's kind of like a source code that when it gets edited, you just add the revision, and it keeps it all. So there's probably sort of a full record of the death that has been locked into that quarter. So let's see if I can discover the key of death and Hades. So if you integrate those things and you become aware of your superego and how it's functioning in this backroom consortium and committee that has power over shaping the ego, in some sense, or it's an indirect shaping. Yeah, again, these are, I call the superego the procedural, the doing, and the unconscious the participatory, which is what I call the do, that you do participation, and that your actual framework. The superego is I sometimes even think of it as the environmental unconsciousness, but because there is no distinction, it has a kind of fundamental God's eye perspective. It's a purely so yeah, the proper use of the superego is that it must be kept in a kind of pristine a priori functioning. I would say it has to be considered a kind of a priori thing, which also means that people should have natural weaknesses to or susceptibilities to their super. Oh no, I'm saying this on the level of metagram, because I've also. Anyway, this connects with the ideas that I've been having about metagram, that for example, and this hasn't been fully reverse engineered yet, so this is kind of a little bit unverified, but if it is true that that my constructions of the different emotional tones is correct, and if it is true that I am, for example, a sattvic individual, that means that I am. Yeah, I mean, I was going to talk about this idea. Any one of the gunas are going to have a blind spot over the elements that are missing from that guna's emotional tones. So, for example, again, if I'm correct, then the sattvic emotional tones are made up of sattvic elements and tamasic elements, and they leave out Rajasic elements. And so if I am Sattvic, and if this is correct, what I say about the tones, then that means that when I see, now this is not the same as saying that I can't deal with Rajasic emotional tones, because Rajasic emotional tones are a combination themselves of Sattva and Rajas. So I can half relate to all Rajasic emotional tones, but they're the elemental components that are Rajasic in them, I can't relate to them. Or this is actually true. This is not entirely true. I will relate to them as they appear in my metatype. And for me, a large constituent, or all the I'll tell you. So I'm a metatype 13. 4, 5, and 6, and 15 are the Rajasic elements. Dimensions 4, 5, and 6, and dimensions 15. Dimension 15 is my unconscious inferior function. So that should mean something. That element will mean something quite important to me in my metatype. And my superego child function is dimension 4. My superego dominant function is dimension 5, and my superego parent function is dimension 6. So if those things only have, so if those three elements, Rajasic elements, are only in my superego, so that's what they are to me. They're in my superego, and I don't deal with them in terms of my emotional tones, which again is something that probably only applies to my unconscious. I was going to say like my unconscious processing of the mystery of life, or the context of my experience. Because emotional tones are themselves just a model, a way of modeling how. It's where like I've got so many models, and just working out how they intersect with one another and interpenetrate, and sort of impinge on one another is a bit special to have to keep track of, and it is obviously going to be quite sophisticated, and I haven't fully rendered it, but it's probably something like that the this is I haven't pieced together the whole narrative yet, so that the participatory, so my current sort of thinking is that people start off as metatypes, and they start off with developing from their superego into, which kind of gets uploaded into their ego, and then their ego tries to set up its own subconscious, its own independent perspective, a stable perspective, from the propositions that were sort of spun up from the superego, from a kind of taking some sustenance from the superego, but then sort of starting the long, arduous journey of trying to develop its own thing. And once the subconscious develops enough stability for the ego, which is always going to be a tenuous thing without the unconscious is the last thing to be developed. And when the unconscious develops, then the ego will actually be properly instantiated as a real boy, instead of just a puppet of the superego, and something that's capable of coming to life, something that's capable of quickening through some ever refinement of the unconscious, or not absolutely forever. I do think that there are accolades and graduations to be had, but in some sense the unconscious is our portal to spiritual, religious, but also any kind of meaningful experience. The way that it reaches us is through the participatory, through the unconscious, and the conduit is always karma. The medium will always be karma, and we have to sort of contextually transcend the medium, but we transcend it by actively transcending it, not by sort of, it's a constant pursuit or activity. It's not it's an eternal life. It's not it's not an immortal perfection. And you can almost see some philosophical beginnings of this, sort of in Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence and such. Anyway, and this, so potentially metagram emotional tones are quite profound within some kind of dualism, within some kind of philosophical dualism, but they are potentially quite far-reaching in their explanatory power, but also quite it's interesting. In The Wizard of Oz, the movie starts off in black and white, and then when she goes to Oz, the land of Oz, there's color. And I would say that the color is like karma. Within the huge metaphor of that whole story, the color is meant to symbolize the color of law. And there is a deep mystery about law itself. Is a reflection for the depth of the dignity of the individual, perhaps, and the burden to be surmounted and overcome. Anyway, that the spirit of man is never defeated, but it is overcome. It is never finally defeated, but it is even eternally overcome. Anyway, so there is this karmic potentiality within the field of possibilities of emotional tones, which are themselves going to be self-relatable into one's own metatype framework and construct, where those elements that make up these emotional tones are scattered throughout that particular landscape and have a particular functioning within the context of that metatype. And they will obviously be found in different areas of other people's of different metatypes. Which maybe will confuse things like language and culture and convention that is shared in kind of in communities which are an amalgamation of people of different metatypes. But within this field of potential correlating, because in some sense these things, these emotional tones are never going to, they never reach a conclusion. They are just always in some cycle within the kind of feng shui that happens within the various field circuits, that they are in a particular spin, they're in a particular state, and that has a way that it can rearrange itself into a different expression of the same potential charge, but placed in different orientations. And that then will produce drama if people are set in themselves to using particular emotional tones. They will be forced into a kind of sympathetic run through of the kind of intrinsic exchanges that they will be drawn into inducing in one another or extracting from one another. It's kind of like chemistry, like literally like chemistry. You can kind of predict the different isotopes that are possible from certain compositions of, sort of ingredient and sort of potential catalyst. And so the settling of somebody's so what is even functioning this stuff? So the parent function in the unconscious side of the mind is the most free hand that is doing this stuff. The content in the base is going to sort of orientate the whole edifice to have a particular content, and then the dominant function is going to be potentially also quite representative of the overarching style of management that has been worked, and the child function is going to hold the motivational component for why the parent function is acting, and how the dominant function is organizing its library and collection of aligned its scholar-scribed, sort of recordings. And anyway, so I guess within this, there's going to be some kind of participatory valence of self. So I don't think it's a self-identity, but it's a signature of participation, that one is going to identify the self as some kind of signature of identification. And the parent function attached to that identity is going to produce a question in the ego's inferior function. Anyway, so what I was going to say. So, you have these array of. Okay, so what I'm trying to weave in here is, and what I'm trying to integrate here is that people are going to have some kind of personal, deep connection to the elements that are connected to their emotional tones that are used in their circuitry. And they're going to have only metatype sensitivities to the elements that aren't covered. So they're going to seem wooden in how they interact with elements, and they're going to be wooden to the extent that their metatype functioning has certain let's call them preferential prescriptions or kind of projected preferences or something. Or they might be quite wooden in the sense that they would not be able to track them in the emotional tone components that they're being expressed at. Anyway, what's the point of saying this? The point of talking about this is that so I do think that the unconscious is, on some level, it knows more about all the contents of all the drama that's going on. And perhaps even the superego has a special hidden hand over organizing these things, because it can sort of be selectively, because it's so wooden, and it's, this might not be for everyone, because other people's superego might involve elements in their metagram type that are part of the emotional tones that they use. So anyway, some people might have a different anatomy of woodenness, depending on what guna they are and their particular, and how that their emotional tone, elemental oversight, or blind spots lines up on top of their metatype structure. Anyway, that's something that I've repeated saying now, and what I was trying to drive at is, well, I guess when the unconscious side of the mind has enough experience of identifying itself, or its sort of perspective, its subjective source of experience, it's when the unconscious side of the mind makes a model of the ego as having a particular emotional tone signature, the guna is then the guna starts being experienced as what I've described earlier as the woodenness of some parts of the metatype, and the self involution of the other elements of the metatype that are being engaged as one participates in the ego in terms of one's own unconscious tracking of oneself, as being the signature of participatory emotional tone. So even my metagram circuits are themselves so hard to define, because it's how, I mean, I've just defined it now, is it's how the unconscious sees the ego from the unconscious, from the unconscious's point of view, and that itself is such a confused way of talking, because the unconscious is your style of participate, is your participatory sense of for that, for what you do, that's sort of inbuilt in your kind of, in your sense of it's weird because no one knows what it is that they do themselves. People don't. It's a mystery. It's a mystery what you do, because you need an objective framework, or you, which I think is the most objective you can be is use principles. You can't actually make a materialistic objectivism. You can't make an absolute framework. Principles are all you have, which are essentially what make the whole thing fundamentally mysterious, rather than some kind of determinism or fatalism, or some other kind of monism. It has to be that there is no monist causal description. It has to be well, in the pertinent sense here, the unconscious is only grounded when it has a model of its own propositional container. So I do think that perhaps the unconscious side of the mind does have a kind of view of one's own propositional capacity. And so the components of that propositional capacity are what are mapped out in metagram circuitry, which will have a unique relation into one's own metatype signature, which is where the unconscious is found. The unconscious is a particular segment of the metatype structure and anatomy and architecture of a particular metatype. And also the propositional ego is also another section of the metatype. So it's how these two things, how the unconscious side of the mind frames the ego or names the ego in terms of its participatory context, in terms of, well, it can actually be translated into two separate almost indexical things, that you could take the emotional tones themselves as being the fundamental constituents of karma and the fundamental constituents of the illusion of the objective shared simulation and shared holographic experience, or you could take it as personally related to your own psychological schema and the structure that is in some sense, you could take it from a more sort of super ego perspective, which is like, well, how is this impinging on your own false ego complex? How does this circuitry particularly manifest with yourself, with your own psychological metatype architecture? Obviously, dealing with the emotional tones as being, let's say, the closest thing to the objective reality as you can get is fundamentally disorientating to, let's say, the personal context. But man, I still haven't made this extra point that I keep on wanting to raise, and it's just come up again, is that the elements that aren't involved in your emotional tones also have to be managed. They also have to be administered by some kind of participatory practice, by some kind of participatory way of dealing with it, way of administering those issues. And so there is a need for a metamorality to cover the elements, to cover the parts of your metatype which are not involved in your own metatype circuitry. And I think that your own metatype circuitry will also have a toxic tendency of, and in some sense I think that this is when people manifest overt pathology that is obviously self-directed. It has been conscious, and in some sense this might be especially relevant to borderlines, and maybe also in some level relevant to narcissism as well, that because the elements of your metatype which are not correspondent to any of your guna, your emotional tone, cognitive inflection, guna sort of footprint, is going to be a potential garbage dump. It's going to be a pressure release valve. It's going to be, and so, but if you try to poison that, you are also going to create really artificial and, let me just say, like, they're going to be disastrous ways of structuring your own metatype component that corresponds to that element that is not part of your emotional tone. So, like, you can, I think a lot of people, when they develop their metagram type, it's a juvenile and perhaps a natural practice for children to toy with it, that they can indulge in offloading a kind of cognitive dissonance into, obviously this is why people are so, the ordinary person within society at the moment is incredibly childish. I mean, they are just so badly, I don't want to say like educated. I mean that they are stuck in an early level of development. They are stuck in a form of arrested development. All of these Keegan stage 3 things, or this all related to the participatory, to the unconscious side of the mind. And this is simply, I would say, a reflection of the fact that they have often, not only do they perhaps practice some very sort of what I would call a kind of intellectual dishonesty with their metagram circuitry, through their metagram circuitry, is perpetrating a kind of intellectual dishonesty, that they are clearly bullshitting themselves. But they're doing so because they have indulged in a kind of, in an overtly corrupt form of metamorality, which allows them to abuse the elements of what fall outside of their guna's elemental footprint, their guna's emotional tone blind spot. They are exploiting their guna's emotional tone blind spot. And this is only kept in check by a certain level of metamorality, because in some sense everyone has a blind spot in this way. So sattva, their blind spot is rajasic elements. Tamas, their blind spot is sattvic elements. And rajas, their blind spot is tamasic elements. And if you exploit those, if you have a kind of corrupted metamorality attached to your unconsciousness, and so this, anyway, I haven't brought it up that nicely, but this issue of a metamorality to govern the blind spot of your particular circuitry is probably important. And anyway, I would connect this very deeply to the kind of moral relativism which is culturally indulged in, and which in some sense has a general cultural scapegoat in the demoralization of masculine sexual energy and the dehumanization and depersonalization of masculine sexuality, so that this never-ending, sort of corrupted metamorality can sustain itself, although it's growing more and more unsustainable and brittle and sort of self-aggravating, etc., etc. But anyway, what should I be saying now? So, yeah, so I'm still, I don't know who to say. I'm not sure where exactly is the unconscious holding the signature. I mean, I guess it would be between the parent function and the base of the unconscious, which is the subconscious inferior. So that's important to note. And then there's going to be baggage also, or residue of that election in the dominant function of the unconscious, so that the dominant function will have to be perfected, or I've tried to describe some kind of therapeutic process that I call perfecting the vanity, which is that would actually not help, because perfecting the vanity is just about increasing the communication between the unconscious and the ego in this case, by integrating the dominant function with the unconscious's own inferior function, which is the base of the ego. But yeah, so I don't think we need that, but we perhaps need just looking at the parent function of the unconscious and looking at the base of the unconscious. Yeah, so it's all really to do then with a combination of the base of the unconscious and the dominant function of the unconscious have to in tandem be unnamed and reforged in some new I mean, I would think that the general solution is that they need to become free agents that are situated in present time and not in a kind of a narrative signature of, sort of a kind of scripted persona that you can rewrite your own story in real time, and that is the opening up of free choice into your action, into your participatory involvement. So that might be this is interesting, because that is the core of the false ego complex to some degree. That's right in the middle, because there are 18 components in the false ego complex, because I count the sin of the ego and the base of the superego, which is the same thing. I count that twice. And so let me see exactly where the middle is. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that's the inferior function. 9 from the left is the subconscious inferior function, which is the base of the subconscious. And if I counted 9 from the other side, I would get the child function, not the dominant function. Anyway, I said the dominant function because that was what would contain the residue. But at the same time, that would also imply reworking the child function to some degree, or unlocking the child function. But I would think that you might have to break some habits in the dominant function before you can just kind of jailbreak the child function. But that might be a clue as well, that the child, you have to try to manage in freeing the child function, which then would then perhaps also illuminate what residue needs to be you need to be unshackled from. So that might be the central. It's interesting. So I wonder if my model of metagram circuitry is probably the content of the dominant function in the unconscious. But the thing that you actually have to rehabilitate and jailbreak is just the inferior and the child function, probably. But that would also perhaps imply... I mean, I've always tried to work out... I mean, it was too early for me to do that because I didn't even have my metatype model properly worked out. But I always thought, these metagram emotional tones, they must have some efficacy, because they can really prove to you how you're locked into a kind of dramatization of cognitive habitual thinking. It doesn't tell you the content of your thoughts, but it tells you the style of the cognitive inflections and the sequences that you're running through in a kind of loop. And that itself, I think... oh man, I was going to... Okay, sorry, I've just kind of finished up. I think I've said enough about this topic, but there was another topic that I wanted to bring up, which was about harmonics, about how, in some sense, you will always have a footprint in emotional tones. The point is your ability to be able to kind of use them all in the right time, in the right place, that you don't have a particular constriction or aversion. And you see, like, what I was already trying to describe in other recordings about how transcendental use of emotional tones would how I could describe them technically, is that it ends up being a kind of harmonic self-consistency, because what you say has a kind of rings true in a kind of chorus of all the other... It is representative of a multiple state of 4 different field circuits that are harmonically being expressed in a chorus of internal self-consistency. And that doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean... But that might be a harmonic tonal expression that is good enough to carry or to solve a particular context or something like that, because the actual source of context is the agentic final 5 participation of the other agents that are often covered in these emotional tones and perhaps confused by them or deluded by them. There's a beautiful description of this, in some sense, in the Gita, when it talks about how the living entity, the spirit soul, is covered by its enemy. When it describes it as material energy. It's interesting that in the Christian scripture it talks about... it gives probably a much better description of material energy when it says it's the temporal nature of things, which is the flesh. And it really is the concept of temporality that is the basis of the narrative that we end up incepting ourselves into a material mode of self-delusion. That you've sort of covered over yourself in this karmic thinking that you are being carried away by, and it doesn't have a conclusive edification at the end of the rainbow. It doesn't actually deliver anything. The sequences are either infinite or they are hollow. The best you can do with them is try to create some kind of harmony. And it's interesting that what is called in math the harmonic series or sequence. My terminology might be horrendous. That it is an infinite series, but it's interesting because it's sort of it's paradoxical. It's a very special kind of series because if you add like a constant to it, I believe it conserves that what is, like if you add some kind of context to it, it does a very good job of conserving that information that you added on top of it. And that's because it sort of it slows itself down the longer it proceeds. But it's still an infinite series. It's still Mythologia videos. He uses this phrase when he's talking about properties of certain series, that if it explodes to infinity, it mean, is the sum of this series, does it converge in a natural number, or does it explode to infinity? And it does actually explode to infinity, but it kind of boggles the mind because the longer the series goes, the slower it goes. So it's decelerating, but it still explodes to infinity, which seems, it's a very special kind of intuitive, counterintuitive thing. I mean, obviously when you're dealing with, there's no such thing as infinity. And so, as soon as you're doing that, you're doing something weird. Anyway, I don't want to talk about maths too much, but there was actually anyway, I had ideas earlier about how it was quite a beautiful metaphor for the emotional tones. Anyway, I think also one of the keys to this is written in Revelations when it says that you will receive a white stone that has your name on it, and that only you will be able to read the name. And that might refer to how the parent function, the unconscious, gets to define its own base. And if you are doing that somewhat consciously, that you have found a way to hack your unconscious side of the mind and consciously drive it, that it becomes a vehicle for an integrated ego that is capable of self-identifying itself, of self-realizing, and therefore also you shouldn't use it, I guess, to more easily or conveniently self-actualize, but I would say that self-actualization is the responsible and ongoing use of this this white stone with your name on it. Perhaps the white stone is meant to symbolize the cleansing of the dominant function, and maybe also the child function of the unconscious side of the mind. And so that your prayer becomes I don't know the word that means to promulgate a constitution, your prayer is the active promulgation of your own constitutive participatory vehicle, or participatory nature, which is not an identity, it is as it is. So yeah, if this functions how I've said it functions, and you have got a way of connecting the question with the only itself, then you've completed this circuit, which means that what is happening will have an automatic knock-on effect on the superego, or that this will already be internally mediated and connected with and co-extant with the superego's disposition, which also means, in some sense, that you will suffer the any sort of internal inconsistency as a anyway, I mean, I think that this is not really a real source of concern, but this is essentially the need for the continual use of the crucifixion, I die daily, that is amalgamating the question and the only itself, or importing between them, so that and the only things that you're going to suffer are going to be born from your own prayer, essentially. In some sense, this does perhaps require preparatory work in terms of clearing the superego, or at least situating yourself in the nature of the contents of it. In some sense, the most toxic element of the whole false ego complex is the superego's performance of the answer in the subconscious inferior function, the base of the unconscious, and the imposition of the terminal beast, which is the sin of the ego. And I was thinking is that this is tough because I don't have all the answers here. That perhaps there is a rest that is imposed on the beast in terms of the whole superego gets radically purged. And there is a much more peaceful, collaborative, or organically and fluid sort of circuitry in the from the former condition of the superego, but that the sin of the ego, the base of the superego, and perhaps predominantly the dominant function of the superego, has already taken on and been perfected by the inferior function of the superego, which is the base of the subconscious, because the subconscious is, let's say, properly subordinated by the unconscious. And then that civilized subconscious is used to alleviate the fundamental, sort of agony and trauma and sort of reactive control that the superego had been engaged in perpetrating. And in some sense, it's sort of the main instigator and sort of the puppet master. It's literally the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. That you make friends with the man behind the curtain. And then the world makes sense. And there's not magic in it. The mystery is finished because the illusion comes down. But then you still have to do the work of, sort of getting the hot air balloon together so that you can fly out of Oz, the land of Oz. Anyway, so I think that which is it, that if you can sort of conduct yourself within some kind of procedural compunction, you will avoid a lot of charge of drama and cognitive dissonance that you were unconsciously treading on, just because you're observing and treating the superego with more care. And more sort of fundamental respect. So I wonder what would that entail. And in some sense, I'm trying to work out is, do you get a rejuvenation of the base of the superego? Because that is, I've called it even the terminal beast, and in some sense it's the terminal death. And can that come back to life, or is it always just part of this relay that's just waiting to show its, is it still the basic condition upon which your operating structure moves from, or can it actually start to, I guess if you do what I said about the unconscious, then that could resonate, that that dominant function and base of the unconscious being purged and cleansed, and being its own nature of choice of how it participates, could be moving from what was the beast before, could be moving the perspective, or operating from a consciousness of what was before the conditioning of a beast, the imprinting of a beast, but instead now it can be an organic and fluid, conscious part of the equation. The thing is that the dimension that was occupied by the beast is going to be quite far from one's attention, because participation centers on the metatype structures. You see, again, now I start brushing up against the question of, do you ever get away from your metatype? Can you break your metatype, or only the metagram? And I haven't quite, because if I start saying, oh, we start doing interesting things, you can't do too much of it, because it's just one piece. I mean, all of the cognitive functions, all of the dimensions are within one another, are integrated within one another. But you could perhaps engage and participate in those things like never before, perhaps, that you could gain access to the blind spot. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Gain access to the blind spots. So that particular section of elements, because it will always be connected to some particular section of elements, or perhaps two sections of elements. Someone's superego will either have one or two, pretty much, or maybe three, depending on what metatype they are at. I mean, actually, each section of elements, the most dense is between dimension 14, between dimension 11 and dimension 16 is the most dense. Or between dimension 11 and dimension 3, that's also pretty dense. No, what I said earlier is more dense. Anyway, so if that section was, if that dense section of different elements after, let's see if someone's, I'll have to work out what metatypes those might be. That would be quite interesting, having so many different. Maybe those are the people that seem quite prone to being wooden, because they have such a broad blind spot, or they have such a broad wooden. Oh no, that's not how I defined wooden. Wooden has to do with your guna. Anyway. Yeah, so anyway, I've said enough.